Good morning. It's
Good morning.
Friday. Friday, as my kids say.
Friday, that's good.
Friday.
How are you feeling today, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm recovering from a minor cold, so it would seem, which is better than the pneumonia my daughter got when she got this cold.
Pneumonia.
Like literally pneumonia, yeah.
Not pneumonia.
Oh, cough. Already, you've got me already.
I thought
How
that
do you
was
say
her.
it?
Like, I thought she was calling it that because you couldn't pronounce
Pneumonia.
it. And you
No,
were
I just,
rolling with it.
no. It's me. The problem is me. Yeah. My name is Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick and I'm a professor of climate science at the Australian National University in Canberra.
I'm Iain Strachan, a former journalist turned science communicator. We're members of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for 21st Century Weather.
And this is Totally Cooked, the climate and weather podcast.
Grab a water bottle and a hat because this episode is an absolute scorcher. A British person would say scorcher. I've got to be...
Scorcher.
A
Can you
scorcher.
say it straight with an Australian accent? Scorcher.
Scorcher. Well, scorcher would be like ended in A. Scorcher.
That's it. It. It's funny trying to teach my kids how to read and like getting them to do it phonetically, like, you know, ER makes an sound, but then they go scorcher or,
Scorcher, mate.
you know, other. Like it's other technically speaking, but yeah, we're Australian. So,
What can you do? You're not going to teach them received pronunciation. I just roll with it.
well, that's it. And there's so many words, regardless of your accent, that just break all these rules, right? And they're like, I don't get it. I'm like, no, neither do I. You've just got to accept it and move on.
Anyway,
Yeah, we're not very good at that here.
so what would you say if someone put you on the spot and said, what's your definition of a drought? What would you normally say?
Are we doing like a general public definition or science definition?
Both, please.
Okay, so general public is when it's really dry for a long period of time.
Sick.
Science definition is when there isn't enough moisture around to meet the demands of the system or
Earth
systems
system.
of interest. Yeah. So well, a system could be agricultural system, a city, an ecosystem. And they vary across the world, right? Or even across, you know, a smaller area. So
Does that
what
mean-
might be a drought in one place may not be a drought in another place. I'm thinking like Europe compared to Australia there.
What's a fire?
What's a fire?
What's a fire?
We have swung from like one extreme to the other very quickly. A fire is when things burn.
Yeah.
I'm sure most people would have that understanding. But we get, you know, we can get wildfires. In Australia, we actually call them bushfires, but they're the same as wildfires in other parts of the world where, you know, native vegetation burns often out of control and needs human intervention to put it out.
In the UK, we call them forest fires.
Oh, really? I didn't actually know that, but of course it makes sense, yes. But you don't have much forest over there.
Well, there's a little bit.
A little bit. You got rid of that thousands of years ago.
Thousands of years ago. Yeah, mostly like Neolithic, Stone Age. People got
Okay.
rid of a lot of forests. They denuded the landscape.
Who needs trees?
Who needs them? Well, the Royal Navy used up a lot of the rest of it, building
Right.
wooden ships. So
Yep.
that's cool. Zach's written that fires are a chemical reaction of combustion.
You know, something gets hot because it's lit with a flame. Yeah, and it goes up in smoke, like quite literally.
And we love it in our fireplace, but not in the bush or the backyard.
Absolutely. Like, honestly, who wants a wildfire to happen, particularly near them?
In his script, Zach has written that fires have a huge crush on droughts. What does he mean?
They have a huge crush. So you're much more likely to have a fire season or bad fire weather when things are dry. So when the fuel dries out, and by fuel I mean vegetation, it's ripe for a fire, right? In any sort of fire situation, the fuel needs to be dry. So think about putting logs on your fire at night. They're dry. If it's a wet log, it ain't going to light. And it's the same like that when you're talking about bushfires here in Australia, likely forest fires in the UK, and wildfires anywhere else. It's got to be dry. So when we have a drought and things are dry for a prolonged period, you know, so we've mentioned months, it allows that vegetation to dry out. And that when an ignition factor happens, it's much more likely to literally go up in smoke. And oftentimes the vegetation that has a high oil content, we have a lot of those in Australia, like our eucalyptus trees are full of it, and even pine plantations as well. Because they have that oil content, when they burn, they burn.
What role does our friend climate change have in the relationship between droughts and fires?
Yeah, this is a really good one, and I think it's one that we're still trying to work on. So the climate change factor comes down to fire weather. You need to have fire conditions in order for ignition to actually happen. But you could have the worst fire weather imaginable, and if you don't get an ignition, then the fire won't occur. You need both for a fire to happen, but climate change doesn't change the ignition. It affects the fire weather. Fire isn't only just related to drought, it's also related to temperature. And as conditions get hotter, So when we have heat waves, for example, things dry out more quickly. The vegetation dries out more quickly, so it cures it in a quicker fashion. You're more likely to have high temperatures and heat waves when it's dry, and so therefore in both of those conditions you're more likely to have bad fire weather. The drought, heat and fire interrelationship is a very close one, and certainly fire is tied to not just drought but heat as well.
Great, thank you. That's the episode in a nutshell. Now we'll do it.
Okay.
Now we'll do it in. No, that's great.
I've overachieved. I've just
typical, isn't that typical? Oh, I don't know what I'm doing. Oh, no. Oh, well, somehow a tenured academic.
Why am I here? I'm a shit scientist, blah, blah, blah.
I would like now, before we get into all those subjects in more detail, the first section that we're going to talk about is Aussie conditions. Digression. So Aussie and Oz doesn't sound right in British mouths. So British people, unfortunately, you may have noticed this, Sarah, if you've been there, they'll say to you something like, how are things going in Oz? And it's like, yeah, I'm not Glinda. Like,
I know. I've had this. I'm not Dorothy.
It's like, it's Straya. Like, if you want to shorten it, it's ST.
Don't say Straya. No.
But it is though, right?
Australia.
Straya. Like
that really shits me if people say straight, and Australians do it too, right? Like,
no, but that's what I mean. Like, if you're gonna shorten it, you don't shorten it to Oz, you shorten it to Straya.
So you can't say Aussie. You can only say Oz. I can't say
Aussie because you can say Aussie.
Can you do it in an Australian accent just for shits and giggles?
Aussie.
The Americans go like Aussie, and that
Aussie.
Yeah, like, that doesn't sound right.
Aussie. They break it down to two words. Aussie.
Yeah.
That's on its way to like Austria or Österreich.
And even the Kiwis, they say Aussie, like I'm going to Aussie. Not like you're an Aussie.
Oh, as in the place, Aussie.
Yes, yeah.
Kiwis can't do anything wrong in my opinion though. They're like,
they're lovely people.
They're the best.
Highest regard for them, yeah.
Yeah, they're like Australians without the arrogance.
That's actually very accurate.
It's true, isn't it? They've just got no ego. Australia's hot backyard. Yes. There's a few little facts here that I have that you don't have. Haha.
Okay.
According to Cyro via Zach, Australia is the driest inhabited continent in the world.
Yep.
True?
Tick.
What's the driest continent in the world?
Antarctica.
Yeah. And it's not, I mean, there's technicality here, isn't it? Like it's sort of is permanently inhabited now, isn't it? But not naturally inhabited.
Not naturally, and like very sporadic, right?
Yep.
There's no native people there. Maybe some anthropologists might say that, hundreds of thousands of years ago it was inhabited, but nothing there.
It may unfortunately become inhabited.
Give it another 200 years. Maybe that's where, the next housing boom might be. Oh, sorry, that was a bit low.
As we've talked about before, Australia's climate has warmed by an average of 1.5 degrees, give or take, since national records began in 1910. And that warming's led to an increase in the frequency of extreme heat waves over the land and the ocean. Mm-hmm. Oh, and that's your bag.
It is my bag. Oh, sorry, I'm just nodding and saying yes. Yep, that's all factual and correct.
All factual, good, okay.
Do you if you want me to do a deep dive into that, I can, but I'm kind of...
I mean, we've kind of done that, haven't we,
We have. I could have a podcast just about heat waves, to be honest, but that might bore most people.
Haven't we? Have we had that?
A podcast on heat waves. We've had like an ep where we've talked about it, but I mean like an entire podcast dedicated to extreme heat.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah, and you're like, no, that's
I'm not doing that
happening.
One. It's too niche.
It is far too niche. It would just be me listening to myself talk all the time.
I need some wet weather in there as well, please.
Yeah, that's fair. You are British after all.
Okay. And the last point of this little dip into Aussie conditions is, again, our friends at Cyro have pointed out that there has been an increase in extreme fire weather and a longer fire season across large parts of the country since the 1950s. Yeah,
that's right. And we're particularly seeing that in spring, that things are drying out or being like it's getting hotter in spring earlier, whether it's a heat wave or just looking at the average temperature. And that is extending the season. In some parts of the country, it's also extending into autumn a bit more too. But the fire season differs depending on where you are in Australia. So it's earlier in the northern parts and a bit later down further south. But doesn't matter, like especially down south, it is lengthening more. So it's starting to bleed more into the earlier parts of summer and even spring.
Thank you for that. And I've scrolled down to the first major section of this episode, which is about droughts. And and I'm deeply concerned that we've premmed it. But the first question is, what is a drought and how do we define it?
No
I know
moisture.
that you've touched on this already, but this is your opportunity
It's like-
to go even deeper.
Like, with heat waves, we just have like a word salad. That's a general definition for basically it's got to be hot for a bit. And droughts, it's kind of the same. You have this long formal definition that papers mention all the time. It's basically like it's dry for a while. Like what constitutes dry or how very dry or, why it's dry. It depends as to why you're looking at droughts in the first place. That's why we can't have a universal, this is precisely how we measure drought and why it matters. Like there's just a lot of ways to skin this cat, pardon the phrase, if you're into cat skinning at all. But basically, it's got to be dry for a while, very dry for a while.
I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that because in this really excellent paper on a review of meteorological droughts in Australia, in the abstract, which is, the kind of summary of what the paper says, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's like, droughts happen when there's an absence of moisture. And I'm like, well, yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's a bit of a
Duh.
no shit Sherlock moment, right? And that's not to take away from the amazing researchers who actually do research on drought, and a lot of them are actually in our centre. But yeah, again, like we have to have these formal definitions, but for something like drought or heat, there's so much subjectiveness to it, and it's all got to be relative to like local climates and local conditions, and even the system you're interested in researching the impact on. That's why those overarching definitions are just very general and you could probably sum up in a couple of words.
Yep. And then you've got to dig deeper into each separate one.
Precisely. Yeah. Like again, heat waves, it's hot.
Moving on, I'd like to ask, what are the causes and drivers of drought? How do they start?
No rain. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Okay, see you next week.
You really needed like a climate scientist to tell you that they occur when there's no rain. So it depends on the location of the drought, for example. So modes of climate variability, I know that's, again, yet another word salad. Climate science is full of word salads. There are different influences on our local climate. So they can happen at seasonal scales, yearly scales, and also at weather scales as well, so at days. So, for example, in Australia, when we have an El Nino event, we tend to have less rainfall. Right? We especially have less rainfall during winter and spring when an El Nino is actually occurring. Less rainfall means more drought, okay, or a higher likelihood of drought. I would definitely won't say we always get a drought during El Nino, but it's a higher likelihood because there's been less rain over that 3 to 6 month period, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes that also continues into summer. So, having this driver or this modulator of climate or whatever you want to call it happen then kind of, I guess, loads the dice towards certain weather systems occurring, like high pressure systems that don't bring rainfall with them. It doesn't always have to happen with El Nino, for example, in Australia. We have other influences on our climate system. But usually we have at least one of these modes activated and in a phase that means less rainfall for Australia, for a drought to at least be initiated and sometimes perpetuated if it goes on for years.
And then that lack of precipitation will then result in reduced soil moisture.
Correct, yeah. So it starts with no rain or less rain. You still might get a little bit of rain in a drought, but it's significantly less than normal. If you've got no rain, then, soil dries out, your rivers run dry, and then that's when we move. So you start off with the meteorological drought and then you move into the other types of drought, but it starts off with a lack of rain.
Well, I mean, that's actually a good jumping off point to talk about how human activities interact with droughts. So we can think about land use changes.
So, how we use the land obviously affects how water moves naturally within a system. So if we build a dam upstream, you stop water going downstream, that can cause an agricultural drought in a different part of, that river basin. And that's what we need to be really careful of, particularly in a place like Australia where water is a precious resource. How do we change our activities such that we don't, amplify the effects of a meteorological drought or even potentially cause one further downstream because those people just simply aren't getting enough naturally flowing water.
And the next big question is, what are the effects of drought, the impacts? What does it do?
They're bad. Next.
So the droughts start when there's no rain. What do they do? They're bad.
Yeah, so like things dry out, okay? That's fairly obvious. If you don't water your plants for a while, they dry and they die. It's happening in my garden right now. Crops can't, if it's too dry, they'll obviously die out. A lot of the time there's water restrictions. Farmers can't water their crops. If there's not enough crops for a certain, food source, whether it's wheat or even just fruit or something like that, prices go up for that particular resource. There's economical impacts for farmers. Native ecosystems suffer as well, and you can have vegetation die back. There's a huge link to fires there, so it could because the vegetation dries out in these native ecosystems. Human societies can be really badly affected. There was a huge drought in Melbourne. It was a millennium drought, and water resources were incredibly scarce in Melbourne, and people were literally putting buckets in their showers to save that water to use for other purposes. And, that was only, a minor restriction. So, yeah, there's a lack of water, and it can perpetuate throughout, many different systems.
Yeah, I'd like to zoom in if I can on the human health impacts as well. Is that something that you or anyone in your team looks at particularly closely, or anyone?
No, not so much for droughts. We look at the health impacts of heat waves. But certainly for droughts, I know mental health is a huge issue in the farming community.
Yep.
And that, we need a lot of support for farmers because they aren't producing any yields. It can affect their economic livelihood and then have mass impacts on their family and obviously their mental health too, and the communities there too. In terms of how it impacts other people, not just farmers, I'm not entirely sure. So maybe you can fill me in with some.
Yeah, I was thinking we have an Australian lens on droughts because we're based in Australia and that's what we're talking about. But if we think about elsewhere in the world, Australia as a very advanced economy is maybe perhaps more insulated against some of the impacts of droughts, the downstream impacts of droughts than other countries are. There's, maybe a higher risk of things like malnutrition and increased communicable diseases.
That's true.
And population displacement as well. So,
and absolutely, this is what's been happening in the African drought, right? Is displace people out of their, I was going to say natural environments. That's not the right expression. What am I looking for?
Their kind of their homes, their local area.
Yeah. So it's displacing these people from their normal homes. Obviously affecting their livelihoods. But nutrition is a huge impact as well. And this happened in Ethiopia. I remember growing up, and there was a huge drought in Ethiopia that killed. Was it millions of people, but a huge number. And I remember seeing these devastating photos on TV about these poor little children who were so undernourished and just really didn't have any hope. So definitely in a country like Australia, we are protected from that to a certain extent, generally speaking, because we can just eat something else or buy something else if something becomes too expensive. Sure, farmers are impacted in other ways, but, the devastation can permeate many different parts of society.
Thank you. With that in mind, what action can we take in Australia and around the world to combat droughts or to better prepare for them?
Oh, that's a good question. Gosh, I've got so many, locked and loaded for heat waves. We have to be careful with how we use our water. Okay, particularly in Australia. It is a very scarce resource, a precious resource. We have to be careful with how we store our water and what sort of crops we grow. So this might upset some people listening to this podcast, but potentially growing rice in Australia might not be a viable crop because of how much water it needs. And there are other species of crops as well that use a lot of water. And it's not to say, I'm not saying that to take away from people's livelihoods at all, but given if we are going to get these really bad droughts and flash droughts as well that can come on quite suddenly, maybe we need to look at what our main farming practices are so we can better combat what's to come.
Interesting. We're going to move on to fires next, but before we do that, I just want to ask again, I know we've talked about this briefly in the introduction, so we might be repeating ourselves here, but how can droughts make bushfires more likely? So
droughts can make bushfires more likely by simply drying out the landscape. They dry out the fuel that fires need, and by that I mean the plants and vegetation. If something's wet or has a high moisture content, it's not going to go up in flames, or it's much less likely to. But, when you have a drought, and droughts are prolonged, whether we're talking about months or years, they do let the vegetation or make the vegetation dry out to a condition such that it's ripe for ignition. Obviously, the longer the drought, the drier the vegetation becomes. And then when a fire does occur or you have that ignition happen, it's ready to burn.
Okay, let's take that and roll with it. What is a bushfire?
So a bushfire, or a wildfire if you're in some parts of the world, or a forest fire, as I've recently learned.
Just to interject, I'm so sorry, but in the preparation notes, Zach has written landscape fire, which I'm like, that sounds like an artistic motif. Have you been to the NGV and see Turner's landscape fires? What is that?
The answer is no, but that sounds like an interesting artwork if it ever comes about. Yeah, well, it's basically when the native or natural landscape burns effectively, or ecosystems in it. So you can have like a fire in a forest, and we do have forests in Australia of varying kinds, but you can also have grass fires that are wild as well.
I think we talked about this earlier, but is there a universally agreed upon terminology to describe these fires?
No.
Why not?
The more we kind of delve into these sorts of things during these podcasts, the more I realise that a lot of extreme events that happen around the world, they don't have a universal metric or definition. Some do. So like tornadoes and cyclones or typhoons or hurricanes, they have like a proper categorisation system. But some of them are very airy-fairy. I don't actually really know how they do it in the States or how they do in other parts of the world. We do have the Forest Fire Danger Index, or the FFDI, and that measures the conditions. So it's about the fire weather and how dangerous the conditions are.
Is that the same as the like little dial you see on the side of the freeway?
Yeah, so as most people would know, I think even if you're international, we've had a lot of bad bushfires in Australia. Our landscape's prime or very prone to it. And two of our more recent disasters, one in 2009 in Victoria and then 2019-2020, which was basically the whole of southeast Australia coast, has led us to have a national fire danger rating scheme. So prior to that, the states and territories just did their own thing, and it caused a lot of issues with management and warnings because we have a lot of state boundaries that are political boundaries and not native boundaries. So different states would use the FFDI or Forest Fire Danger Rating Index in different ways to categorise the fire weather, so that we have a dial like moderate, extreme, very extreme, and I think catastrophic, or I don't know, I can't remember. It's changed. And that dial used to have more categories, but it would change. If you went to Victoria versus New South Wales, it would change. And they've only really recently realised how confusing that can be for people and how much more the state agencies need to work together to prevent devastating impacts. So the Forest Fire Danger Index, I can kind of talk about how that was created in a bit, but they don't use that anymore to solely underpin that dial. So now we have the AFDRS, or the Australian Fire Danger Rating System. So we still have a dial. It's got 4 segments. But it's a bit of a black box as to what exactly is calculated and how. And that's not just me saying it. I've spoken to a fire expert here where I work and other people in the Bureau of Meteorology who want to calculate this index. And it's very, I'm sure the people who invented it know what they're doing to, help us understand the current fire conditions. But it's not something we can readily compute to understand changes and projections and that sort of thing. But it is universal across Australia.
That's the intelligent answer. When I'm driving along the freeway in regional Victoria and I see the fire danger indicator thing, in the summer it says, be ready to act. And I just cock my finger at it and say to the passenger, always.
I remember that if we're ever in a car together.
Always.
So that's that's actually that was born out of all of these disasters that we've had, because we have had huge losses of lives, particularly during the 2009 summer. 180 something people died. It was horrendous. And that's because there wasn't enough warning and not enough preparation of what to do. So that's that, watch and act, be ready and act. Is your bushfire plan ready? I even have a kids' book at home about bushfires and being prepared for my children to read. All of this has come out of that disaster. So that's why there's a lot of emphasis now and making sure that the dial is easy to understand, for the everyday Australian.
And the everyday Australian does sometimes need a nudge in the right direction.
Absolutely.
I've got a mate from school whose family have got a property on the Murray River in Bundalong, who's now identifiable through this story. But when we used to go there a lot in that time, like 2009, 10, and I, as the kind of cautious Brit who thinks the spiders and the sharks and the bushfires are all going to get them, would say to him, Gibbo, I said his name, Gibbo, what are we going to do if
Gibbo, what an Australian name though. Hi Gibbo, nice to meet you.
What's the bushfire plan? What's your readiness plan? He's like, we'll just get in the Murray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, well, you know what? People did that though. Some people, there's these horrendous photos of a family who got into their local river or dam, I can't quite remember what, and they had little kids clutching to them like koalas as they got into the water during these fires. So some people actually did that because they came over so quickly and they have no other plans in place.
Yep.
gosh, this is going down a very dark path. But I remember growing up in Sydney in I think it was 1994. Yes, when I was in primary school. We had really bad bushfires in basically all of the national parks that surround Sydney. So Sydney was pretty much like enclosed by fire. And people died in their swimming pools. They would go into their swimming pools and it would not end very well, I'll just say that. A river is a bit different. It's a bigger body of lake, and if it's down low, maybe there's huge caveats here, but maybe the fire might just jump over top. It depends on the vegetation around it, but I wouldn't rely on that as an action plan. Far from it. That's like an absolute last resort. And in the case of that family I just talked about, obviously it was, but I wouldn't rely on that. And that's what came out of 2009 and has been re-emphasised recently by the 2019-2020 fires.
Well, I'm thinking now about, are they iconic images? I don't know. What's the right phrasing for this? Notorious and memorable images of people on the beach in Malakuta.
Yep.
In 2020.
There's one that I'm actually getting shivers thinking about it. There was this one photo that this mum took of her young boy, and they were on the water in their dinghy or little boat. And yeah, they were just sitting there because the fires got right up to the beachfront. Like they had nowhere to go. No one in Malakuta had anywhere to go. Only if they had to go any further, it would have been on the water. And some of them actually did that. They didn't go in the water, but they went on the water. Yeah, it was horrendous. And the issue there was there's one road in and out of Malakuta. Like people were more prepared and more fire literate, but it was also, it's a huge holiday destination and it was holiday period. So, we can never, I don't think we can ever fully mitigate against the impacts of fires, but we can certainly make people more aware and more literate. And that's what we do every year. And that's what's come out of those fire disasters that we've had here in Australia in the last couple of decades. We're
going to be talking in a future episode about what the experience is like of living through a climate disaster, a high impact weather event, an extreme event, whatever you want to call it. So I think that this very meaningful but serious digression will be expanded upon further in the future in what could be, quite an emotional but fascinating episode, I think. So watch this space for that. I'd like to talk in more detail about the causes of fire, and I want to focus on 3 different things: fuel, weather, and typography.
Sorry, what was the third one that you said?
Typography.
Typography or topography?
Sorry, typography. Is that the spelling? Topography.
Like as in mountains and valleys?
Yeah, elevation.
Isn't that topography? Please tell me it's topography.
It's topography, yep.
Oh, thank you. Please don't tell me I've got that wrong all my life too. It's the Ray Fiennes moment again.
That was a real I'm Ron Burgundy moment. Like, fuck you, San Diego. He'll read whatever's put in front of him. Thanks, Zach. We've talked about fuel.
Yes.
We've talked about weather. Do you know much about topography of fire, like risks?
For fires lit in the valley, in a valley that you happen to be close to, it's going to travel faster uphill than it does going downhill, and that's because it can go up on the vegetation. Go up, that makes no sense, does it? There's vegetation immediately in front of them.
Intuitively understand what you mean.
But going downhill, there's less to burn because it can't jump.
I've never thought about that before, but it's actually very interesting. Beyond physical destruction, what are the effects and the impacts of fires? So
when you say physical destruction, are you talking about to people, or are you also including ecosystems there too?
Good question. I'm thinking more in this question context about human, social and health impacts.
Okay, so beyond that or within that?
Within that.
Okay. So, firstly, things can burn down. And we've seen this actually, so again, another case study digression, but not really. Canberra in 2003.
Side quest. It's a Sarah side quest.
Sarah side quest. Oh, can we coin that term, please? So in 2003, Canberra had some pretty devastating fires. But they came through. So this was another problem. Like I talked about the 2003 and 2019-2020 fires. Canberra is in the Australian Capital Territory, which is a very small territory embedded within New South Wales. And how the fire risk was communicated between the New South Wales RFS and the ACT RFS wasn't done well, nor was the risk of the fire when it was burning originally in New South Wales, kind of handled particularly well either. So this fire ripped through this set of Brindabella Mountains and devastated a lot of Canberra, a lot of the fringes of Canberra, and also killed a few people as well. So that's, I guess, one clear impact is like the sheer devastation it can cause to where people live.
What about some of I'm going to call this secondary impacts. So let's think of respiratory and cardiovascular disease.
I was getting there. The quest was going to eventuate back after my little tangent that I even got lost in. You have all the immediate things burn down very quickly, impacts. But then you also have impacts that are, for want of a better term, a slow burner and have a much larger scale in which they occur. And, the respiratory effects due to bushfire smoke is that. So again, during the 2019-2020 fires, Sydney, where I lived, had these mass blankets of smoke that engulfed the whole city and beyond, just coming down from the Blue Mountains, which is northwest of Sydney. This happened also in Canberra from a different bushfire, not necessarily burning into Canberra at that time, but blowing the smoke in. And this was just before COVID, and people were wearing those N95 masks in Canberra just to breathe properly. You couldn't go outdoors. We couldn't leave our house. We had to have our air conditioning going on to filter the air. And that had a huge impact on communities. And, some studies even showing that being exposed to that smoke was basically like smoking yourself if you're out there in it. And there are links being shown, with unborn babies having lifelong effects or being predisposed to basically what's akin to cigarette smoke because of those fires.
Have you got the full copy of the script? Are you cheating?
No, I have not seen it. I have not asked for it. I have not looked for it.
So like Zach and I go away, and what we do the week before the episode is we learn some of the things that you already know, and every week you know them all already. And it's like different subject, not my area of interest, but I'm just going to list the things.
I didn't do that this time. When you said heat and fire, I'm like, you know what? I can do it. Well,
like
maybe I could.
I'm glancing at my other screen. I'm like, I wonder if she'll mention pregnancy. And you're like, and there's also adverse pregnancy outcomes. I'm like, fucking hell.
But also, especially with fires, my husband's in the RFS, so I've had that exposure too.
Where are we placing fire? I'm gonna gender it and say fireman. Where are we placing fireman on the hot jobs index? Like, it's right up there, isn't it?
I don't want to say.
It's right up there. I had a friend who was hiking in the Grampians, and their hiking companion injured themselves quite badly, and they had to get helicoptered out by the air ambulance that came up from, I think, Warrnambool. And obviously it's very serious, it wasn't life-threatening, but they really, messed up their ankle and their foot pretty badly and had to get airlifted out.
Yeah, so they couldn't walk out or anything.
Couldn't walk out, no. They walked a little bit to get to a point where the chopper could winch down, and the chopper couldn't land. The person winched down, got them and winched them up. And not only is it dramatic and cool, but Danielle said it's also really hot.
It is. You suddenly have this newfound respect and attraction to someone who's.
You just get to the chopper, flies over and saves you. It's like.
I know, it is. It is like, wow, you must be really fit, and you're just an all-round top person to be dedicating your life to this.
Like I'm a princess that's never done a day's work in their life. Like I just send stupid little emails to people and talk all day. Like it's very much intellectual.
Yeah, ditto, really. Yeah. I don't like field work. I don't like being out in the hot sun.
Me. So I have huge respect for people that can do real stuff. The other metric or rating is your zombie apocalypse, what use are you going to be in the dystopian future world where you have to do everything with your hands and fix stuff and make stuff last? I'd be dead in minutes.
I know, I would be too. I'd be like, just eat me now.
Well, my strategy would be to use my cunning and duplicity to take over. I would run.
Yes. So I'd be similar. I'd be a logical thinker to get out of it, not brute strength.
Yeah.
Not my forte. So we often have conversations because where we live in Canberra is a new suburb, and we've got this most amazing view over the Brindabella Ranges, which I love. I love seeing this every single day. However, that's where the fires came through Canberra. And I've heard a few long-time Canberrans say that if it wasn't for the wind change, those fires could have very well have gotten into the city centre because Canberra, it's the bush capital, right? There's literally bush everywhere, which makes it beautiful. But if you have an unmanaged fire come through, it's literally a tinderbox. It's a disaster waiting to happen, which is what happened in 2003.
Where would you go?
Sydney. Just away, or even to my brother's house that's not as fire prone as what ours are. It's funny actually, most houses in our suburb have to have be more fire resistant, so be built materials to help with that. We're kind of in this little pocket where that wasn't necessary, but you know what, if the house is half a block burned down, then we're at risk too.
Well, it's so interesting that you mentioned this because the last question in the fire section I want to ask is what can we do to protect ourselves against or mitigate fires?
Don't build in a fire-prone area. I think that's But, it's hard to avoid that entirely because there'll be fringes everywhere, right? And we, being in Australia, we do love our native ecosystems. We don't want to get rid of them just because they might be a fire risk. We need to have fire plans, and we're much better in Australia with that than what we used to be. So have a plan and action it early, whether it's what I've just said, like have a plan of going, or, if you do decide to stay back and fight it, what would you do? You should also do like basic things like make sure your gutters are cleaned out and, trees around your house are trimmed back appropriately. You don't have big trees hanging over that might help your house to light up. There's various different tools and things you can do to, the area around your house may burn, but to protect the house itself. Like listen to warnings. When there is bad fire weather, it's really well forecast here in Australia now. There's a lot of effort that goes into that. So take heed of those warnings. If you want to save your life, that's the most important thing you could do.
You've made really good suggestions there about what individuals can do. I'm also interested in what governments, industry, communities, what we can do at a structural level to manage fire risk and mitigate it.
Something that we have touched on today is how we can reduce the fuel load with hazard reduction burns. They're very controversial in Australia. Some people think that they absolutely must be done and some people think that we shouldn't do them at all. So they're very polarising. But that is something that if they're done right can help protect against infrastructure. Now, what right means, I'm not here to debate that. That's not exactly my area. But there's certainly ways that we can manage the landscape in a way that doesn't affect it or doesn't kill our wildlife, but also prevents devastating conditions from actually happening or devastating impacts from happening. So that's the role of our fire services and the RFS. But the issue, there's a two-pronged issue there. Firstly, the time of year, the window in which we can safely have these burns happen is snapping shut because of climate change, because we're seeing a lengthening of the fire season. And also the funding to these services is often not very high. They're volunteer. So, they don't have huge amounts of resources and wholly rely on people giving their time to do it. In terms of what governments can do, well, that's always a loaded question, isn't it?
Buy more water bombers.
Buy more water bombers. Take it seriously. Just take climate change seriously in general. But maybe that's too much for this podcast.
I mean, that seems like very, very reasonable advice to anyone, government, industry, communities, individuals. Take climate change and fires seriously. You can't really argue with that.
No. And it's not just there's a whole emphasis now in the global zeitgeist about net zero, and that's brilliant. I don't want to take away from that because we fundamentally, it's imperative, I can't stress this enough, that we reach net zero as soon as possible. But we also need to adapt. Fires is one type of event that it is imperative that we adapt to. Okay, whether that's how we fight them, the infrastructure that we build and how we protect against fire, how we educate our public, the warnings that we give, we must be very serious in adapting against them or to them.
I want to talk about Indigenous fire knowledge as well, and how we can learn from Indigenous fire knowledge, and indeed, we will be talking about Indigenous weather and climate knowledge in this series as well. So I think maybe we should acknowledge that that's something that we want to talk about, but it isn't the right time to talk about it because we don't have that knowledge. What
I do know, I don't know that much about Indigenous fire practice, but certainly the one thing that I do know is they were managed burns of low intensity. So they would, again, manage it like the RFS does with their control burns, but they'd make sure it was always a low intensity fire.
Yep.
And it moves slowly so animals could move out of the way. Because once things are burnt, they don't burn again, at least for a while. There's a lot of trees in Australia that have a black part of their trunk is black. And that's to protect against fire. They've burnt once before, but they kind of retain that so they don't necessarily burn again, at least in that part of the tree. If you have a crown fire, well, that's a whole different story and they're very intense. But certainly a lowland grass fire, it helps in controlled burns.
I want to talk about disaster bonding.
Disaster bonding. So is this where we bond after talking about all the...
Yeah, trauma bonding.
Trauma bonding, that's it. Yep.
What is a compounding extreme event, please, Sarah?
Okay. So there's actually various definitions. Again, we can't just have one universal definition. It can be where two extreme events occur at the same time or directly after one another. So, droughts and heat waves and bushfires are a good example of that. You might have a heat wave and then immediately have a bushfire. Or you might have an event, like an extreme event that has cascading impacts from it. But I guess the most common or the most one that climate scientists study is that like two events co-occurring or occurring directly one after each other.
Could it be two of the same events, like a flood and another flood
potentially,
in quick
yes.
succession?
Yeah, and that's what happened in Lismore recently when we had that triple dip La Nina.
The triple dip La Nina sounds like something that you win at Crown Casino. Like triple dip La Nina and got $100 out of it.
It does a bit. I just think of someone diving into a pool 3 times. I don't know why.
This might be syntax or semantics, but is a drought and then a bushfire, is that a compounding extreme event, or is that a bit different?
It can be. Like I would say yes, because the drought has its own set of impacts, right? And then you have a fire on top of it, which brings another set of impacts that may or may not amplify the drought impacts.
Yeah.
Again, heat and bushfires, you need, heat contributes to bushfires, but then you have the compounding effect of people dying due to heat and people being exposed to air pollution. So, yeah, just because they're related doesn't mean they're considered one event, if that makes sense.
And is compounding extremes or extreme events something that your research group in particular is looking at? Or
Yes.
Yeah, it is, right? It's your
So I
cup of
have
tea.
one wonderful PhD. Actually, I have multiple wonderful PhD students, but one in particular. Yeah, I know. My team's like, right, that's it. We're leaving, going somewhere else. No, they're all wonderful. But one PhD student in particular is looking at the compounding health effects of heat and bushfires in Southeast Australia.
And will it be a requirement to listen to every episode of Totally Cooked before they get their PhD conferred?
Oh, talk about torture. As if they haven't heard me speak enough at them. I'll make them do that. Maybe they can be like our sounding board. No, yeah, I reckon it should be. I reckon I should put them through that. And
maybe the defense of their thesis can be an episode.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, actually.
What?
Yeah.
No, we're not going to do that. It's unethical and immoral.
No, I really think we should.
Okay. I want to talk finally, before we run out of time, about the relationship between climate change and drought and climate change and fire. How is climate change influencing drought?
Yeah, these are really good questions.
Thank you so much. There's Zach's. But Zach works with me, so I'm claiming it too.
Well, it's hard to say. So this is almost coming back to the attribution question again. It's very easy for extreme heat or temperature in general, because you increase average temperature, everything goes up pretty much, more or less, when you bring in local factors. Drought and fire can be a bit different, especially with fire. So I'll start there, because there's multiple climate and meteorological variables that go into it. So it's the lack of rain, it's the wind, it's the humidity, it's the temperature. So you've got 4 variables just there. With fire and fire weather, that's where the emphasis is. We know that the temperature is driving some change currently. So we know that's where the research is. I wouldn't say it's focused, but that's where we're most sure. Temperatures are going up. Fuels are drying out more quickly. We saw that with Black Summer, and I actually had a PhD student look at that the heat waves immediately before the fires made everything dry out more quickly. How climate change is affecting the winds and the humidity and even the drought is a little less certain, and that they're all factors into fires. But we know that climate change is making the bushfire seasons longer and increasing the severity of the fire weather, likely at least due to the temperature component, maybe the other factors, but we're more sure on the temperature component.
Well, La Nina has been mentioned in this episode.
Yes.
What about the Indian Ocean dipole?
Yeah, this is a really good one. So the Indian Ocean dipole is another climate modulator or influence on Australia. It's active really only during winter and spring, so it's a very short-lived phenomenon. And it can drastically it can basically initiate a drought or drastically amplify a drought that's already occurring. And we had this in 2019, 2020 in the lead up to Black Summer. We're already in a drought. It was a fairly short one, relatively speaking, but the positive Indian Ocean dipole that we had just, dried things out even more. And so it primed conditions to allow for a longer drought or a more intense drought, and then drier fuel, more extreme fire weather.
Your husky voice is going to sound great through the microphone when this one gets done. It's going to be like...
Well, I've noticed when I'm laughing, nothing is coming out. Like everyone's just like, we're probably like, is she even there?
It's like Nina Simone.
I know it's getting, like the huskiness is getting stronger.
Yeah.
This happens to me like every 2 or 3 months at the moment. The kids bring home like the mildest of viruses, although pneumonia is not mild. And then this happens to me without fail. But
You got little germ incubators walking around your house 24/7.
I know, right? Like whose fault is it? Theirs or mine? Like
Yours. You brought it upon yourself.
Exactly.
It's like building in a bushfire zone.
Here I am laughing again.
What is going to happen in the future for fires and droughts?
So this is the $1 million question, right? Like we can't say with precision exactly what will happen, but we know generally speaking that we're likely to see more intense fire weather conditions and a longer fire season. And over Australia, that's particularly true for the southeast. And the fire season is shifting. Like it's different already in different parts of the country, but it will shift and likely get longer and bleed into earlier parts of the year. In terms of drought, when they occur, they'll likely be more intense and potentially last for longer. I'm not so sure on that, but they'll likely be more intense. And then we're now starting to study a phenomenon called flash droughts. And these are droughts that suddenly occur. They happen really quickly. They're a relatively newer phenomenon, but they could also, increase in their intensity with climate change as well. So with climate change and anything related to do with rainfall, the extremes will get more extreme. That's what we think. So when we have an extreme rainfall event, like it's going to rain really hard and harder than it has. But conversely, when we have a drought, it's going to be worse than what it previously has been.
And we're also expecting less cool season rainfall.
That's right. So this is more particular for Australia, but there are parts in Australia, particularly in the south, that rely on getting rainfall during the cooler parts of the year. And that's decreasing. We're seeing a significant decline there, and that decline is projected further into the future as well, which is, given that's when they get most of their rainfall, that's kind of setting them up for very prolonged drought conditions, which, means a lot for what sort of industry and livelihood happens in those regions.
Mm. Okay, well, we've gone into some really great topics this week. I've learned a lot this week, and I learn a lot every week actually. But how do you feel about, in the last episode, we kind of were pretty bummed out by.
Yeah, that was, I went home, like that affected my mood for quite a while actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say last week we were pretty bummed out by the realization that we knew maybe more than most people kind of care to acknowledge. We knew
Even
more,
me.
Yeah, we knew more and we knew it earlier than we care to acknowledge about climate change.
Yep.
This is a sort of different one because, fires and droughts have always happened in Australia.
That's right.
And it's a part and parcel of life in this country, in this region.
Yep. That's correct.
What's your main takeaway from this subject, Sarah? What do you think people need to think about and know?
That maybe I shouldn't have built my house where I did.
Oh.
We're not moving. I know this is a bit soppy, but I almost always picture my own kids in these situations these days and thinking, well, okay, I know this as a scientist, but the impacts of this future is now very, very, very real for me, whether I'm part of that future or I'm long gone. And that's what makes me really sad. And again, it's not just my children, it's every kid and every young person that's alive today. They're going to feel the brunt of this. And I think that's what, like, if I'm allowed the space to go down that track, then that's when I start to feel, quite depressed and sad and anxious as well about what's in store, particularly if we don't, put our grown-up pants on and do more about it.
Where do we get these grown-up pants?
I wish I knew.
Do they have them in Maya or in Kmart?
Look, if I could go to Kmart and buy every politician a pair of grown-up pants, I would do this and walk to Parliament House today if it was that easy. But unfortunately, it's not. And it's not, like I say this more aimed at politicians and not necessarily the everyday person. There's more the everyday person could do, but it can be very limiting when we don't have the resources to do that.
I'm looking forward to starting a new organisation called Pants for Parliament.
Yes, that's
where we carry,
your best idea yet.
Yeah, where we all carry a pair of hard yakka style work pants. We just get those pants and then we carry them to Parliament and lay them on the steps of Parliament House.
And say, these are your grown-up pants.
Here's your grown-up pants. Now get to work fixing this shit.
Yep. Yeah, sort this shit out because we're tired.
Yeah, thank you. You saved it. Like I was kind of thinking, we've talked about serious subjects. We've been a bit emotional, but we feel empowered. And then you were like, I'm scared for my children. I'm like, no, don't go there.
No. But I am. And this is the thing. Every time I'm allowed the space to think about what this means, it's always a roller coaster. So I go from like my science self and then I go down, I feel really sad for my children. And sometimes I get a bit teary about it. But then I also get angry. Okay, because I know what we can do. I get angry and frustrated. And I'm okay with that emotion because that makes me want to act more. And I understand a lot of the stuff that we talk about on this podcast can be really depressing, but I really urge people not to get stuck there. Turn that into something that's more, for want of a better term, but proactive. Like anger, you really want to do something about that anger, so go do it. Don't get stuck in that depressive state. It can be hard to pull you out of that, of course, but try and turn that into something motivating to go and do something about it, whether it's voting or campaigning or even changing what you're doing at home, but go do something about it. And that's where the hope lies about how we can change the future.
Get your empowered pants on.
Yes, get your empowered pants on. I would like that to be a skirt, please, I think.
With pockets. With
pockets, yes. I have got 4 pockets on this dress and it's absolutely amazing.
Maybe like a serious skirt?
Serious skirt, yes.
Yeah, serious skirts and grown-up pants.
You're angry, I don't know, you're angry. What's the piece of clothing that begins with A?
An angry A-line?
That works. That actually works really well.
Next episode, we're going to speak about how the changing climate and weather is impacting Antarctica.
We will be answering questions like, how is the Antarctic Peninsula and Southern Ocean being changed? And why does this matter?
What will the future look like for the animals native to the region? And what can we expect for that future?
And how will these changes affect Australia and its own weather and climate?
For the answers to those questions and plenty more, join us for the next episode of Totally Cooked.
And we'll tackle the climate crisis together.
Pow.
And hopefully I'll have my voice back.